Many people are confused by World War One. Even a lot of people who study it, it is not an easy war to address. The question is, why did World War One occur? What sparked the First World War? And this is a question that I'm going to hope to answer here in this series of lectures today for you guys. The biggest problem is that most Americans don't understand what Europe was about. We study American history in elementary school, middle school, high school, even in college. It's more focused on American history over European history. So there's this kind of confusion as to what Europe was like. By 1900, the continent of Europe is on top of the world. We know that the United States is an emerging power. It is a powerful country, and it's becoming more and more powerful every day. But Europe is still at its peak of power. The military, the world's largest army, was the German Empire, or Germany. The world's largest navy was the United Kingdom of Great Britain. When you look at industrial, the United States was the largest industrial power, but that was really spurned by the Industrial Revolution, the Second Industrial Revolution. Germany and the United Kingdom were still your industrial powers, your industrial powerhouses held over from the 1800s. Technologically, Europe was at the top of its powers as well. If you looked at Germany and Great Britain, those two countries, they made the best weapons. They had the best automobiles. We could talk about automobiles in another lecture and Henry Ford. But the reality of it is, if you wanted the best type of car, you got it in Europe. They will be building tanks, gas. They'll be using chemical and biological weapons, something for which the United States didn't even have a clue about by 1900. Europe will also be at the peak of its imperial power. The United Kingdom, France, Portugal, Germany, and Italy all have large colonies throughout the world, especially in Africa and Asia. Europe will subjugate millions of brown, black, and yellow peoples, all to make the mother country better. Even culturally, if you look at world culture by 1900, everyone looked to Paris, France. Whether it was clothing or art, everyone looked to Paris for the lead. So by 1900, the world was still very Eurocentric. Even in the United States, we still looked to Europe to see where we were going to go. This is going to change after World War I. World War I is essentially the death of old Europe. Now the question is, why does the United States become a world power? How does it grow into eventually replacing European countries as the predominant power? Well, it's because the United States begins copying European society and culture. Americans don't like to hear this. We want to think that we did it all on our own, that we didn't use anybody's example. We just went out there, went into the world, and did our thing. But the United States wanted to be like Europe. We followed the European model. Society, culture. We wanted to industrialize and modernize on the European scale. We looked at the armies and navies of Europe. We looked at the scientific technology of Europe. We wanted those things. And if you look at just how quickly we will change, it's remarkable. By 1900, the United States government owed European nations a great deal of debt. Some of it was still left over from the American Revolution. And most of it was from the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865. We were heavily in debt. But by 1950, just 50 years after that, the United States of America replaced Europe as the dominant superpower in the world. Now, it wasn't just World War I that did this. World War II had a major impact on Europe. It destroyed Europe. It even destroyed the Allied countries like Great Britain and France really lessened their power. But overall, the beginning of the end for European society, the Eurocentric world, was World War I. By 1914, the major European powers were the following. First, you had the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. We call that either the United Kingdom or Great Britain. Some people call it England. That's not technically right. England is a constituent part of the United Kingdom. Within the United Kingdom of Great Britain, you have England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. Those are the countries that we're talking about here. The Third French Republic. This will be a period in French history from after the fall of the Second French Empire, which lasted until 1871. The Third Republic was founded in 1871, and it will go all the way until 1941-ish, okay, when the Germans begin invading and taking down France and Belgium and the Netherlands. You also had the Second German Empire, or the Second German Reich. This country existed, it still exists today, but the empire itself existed from 1871 until 1918. After 1918, it will convert to a democracy, or a more democratic state. You have the Kingdom of Italy, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, sometimes also called Austria-Hungary, it's the dual empire, and the Ottoman Empire. And if you look at the last three, this war will be so destructive that the last three countries I listed, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, will be completely wiped off the map after this war. The other countries will see fundamental change because of the war. The first of these countries that's involved in World War I is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. When the war began, it was actually the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. But sometime in the middle of the war, the southern part of Ireland declared its independence, and this country became known as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. This is a democracy. Most people think because it has a king or a queen that this is a monarchy. It is a monarchy, it's a hereditary monarchy, but it's a constitutional monarchy, and it has liberal political rights. That means many people have the right to vote. And that's what, when we talk about liberal in this particular term, that's what we're really talking about. We're not talking about liberals and conservatives here in the United States today and political beliefs. We're talking about how many people are entitled to the political process. And the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland really was a liberal constitutional monarchy. The head of state was a hereditary monarch, a king or a queen, and that went from father to son, or father and to daughter, or mother to son, or mother to daughter. The head of government is called a prime minister, and this is the head of the parliament. They are appointed by the monarch, the king or the queen, with the consent of parliament. In the United Kingdom, you have a bicameral legislature. It's called Parliament. You have a lot of other countries today that call their legislature Parliament. They get that term from this Parliament. So this Parliament is always capitalized with a P, but when you talk about other countries and they talk about their Parliament, it's a lowercase p, because this is the original Parliament. Now, Parliament being a bicameral legislature, most of you probably know that bicameral means a two-house legislature. The upper house was called the House of Lords. This is made up of the aristocracy. They inherited their seats at birth. These were lifetime appointments. When they died, their children then inherited their position on the House of Lords. This was a veto body. They had the final say in legislation before it came to the king or the queen to be signed. The House of Commons was the democratically elected house, and this house represented the commoners and the middle class. At this time, there were three major political parties. You had the conservatives, that were the upper class, the liberals, which were the middle class, and then labor, which was made up of socialist workers. The United Kingdom had the world's largest empire. There's the old saying that the sun never set on the British Empire, and that was true. Any time during the day, the sun was shining on a British flag somewhere around the world. The British Empire controlled 3/4 of the world's population. It exploited tens of millions of people, all of which to make the home islands, the British Isles, the most powerful country in the world. The second of these countries is another liberal democracy where you had a lot of people involved in the political process. But this is not a constitutional monarchy. This is a representative democracy or a republic like we have here in the United States. And this is the Third French Republic. The head of state was a president, but they were largely ceremonial. They didn't have a lot of power. They were very similar to how we understand the British king or queen to be. In theory, having a lot of power, but in practice, having little or no power. The head of government, who was appointed by the president with the consent of Parliament, the head of Parliament, was called the Premier. Premier is just a French term for prime minister. Premier means, one or first. Prime minister means first minister. Premier is the same as a prime minister. The French Republic also was a bicameral legislature. It had two houses. The upper house was democratically elected. It's called the Senate. And the lower house is also democratically elected, and it's called the Chamber of Deputies. In France, they have a different type of political system, very similar to how they do it in Great Britain, except many, many more. They have multi-parties. Now, Great Britain had those three parties we talked about, the Conservatives, the Liberals, and Labour. There are tens, 20 parties at any time running in France. So they do what's called coalition governments. They have to come together to form a government. In Great Britain, normally, one party is able to have enough seats in Parliament to control it. But in the French Republic, that's not so. Normally, it's 3 or 4 parties coming together to create a supermajority in order to control the government. The only problem with this is it makes these governments very unstable. Because if one party decides to quit, then they may not have enough seats in Parliament to control the government, and the Premier would have to step down and call for new elections. So even though this is a more truer democracy, and you could argue that this is probably the most democratic of all these countries, it does have its problems in that it's not very stable, and governments come and go at will due to just minor issues. France is also the second largest world empire. It controlled lots of places in Asia, Africa. It still controlled some territory in South America and in the Caribbean. Great Britain, of course, had some Caribbean islands as well. So these are going to be your two major European allies, your two major European democracies during World War I. The next country is the Second German Empire, or Reich. Reich means realm. People say it means the same thing as empire, and that's technically true, but it actually means realm, not empire. But it's a semantic. It virtually means the same thing. So when you hear them talking about Hitler's empire, they call it the Third Reich, because it's technically the successor of the Second German Empire, or the Second German Reich. Now, the Second German Empire, people think it's, you hear people talk about the tyranny of the Kaiser and the tyranny of the German autocracy. That's not true. There's this belief that Germany was a dictatorship. It really wasn't. It was a constitutional monarchy, very similar in many ways to Great Britain. But it was a conservative constitutional monarchy, meaning there was less people allowed to vote. The head of state was a hereditary monarch. They called their monarch the Kaiser. Kaiser means Caesar in German. He was an emperor. He had been, prior to the German Reich's creation in 1871, the country that essentially formed Germany was a place called Prussia, and the Kaiser was also the king of Prussia. And when they turned it into an empire, he took the title Kaiser, but he was also still the king of Prussia, which was still a constituent country within the greater German Empire. The Kaiser had a lot more power than, say, the president of France or the king or queen of Great Britain. He could appoint and dismiss the chancellor. He didn't have to ask the parliament about it. He didn't have to get their permission. He didn't have to ask them who they thought should be chancellor. He could appoint whoever he wanted to be the prime minister, essentially. Whoever he wanted. He could make his best friend or a cousin. He also had absolute veto power over legislation. Congress or their parliament could pass whatever they wanted, but at the end of the day, if he didn't like it, he could veto it. Now, people will say, well, this isn't really democratic. Well, I would like to make the argument that the United States, the President of the United States, has a veto power over legislation as well. The only difference between Germany and the United States is that Congress, in the case of the United States, can override with a 2/3 majority in both houses. But in Germany, there was no override provision. If the Kaiser said no to legislation, it died. They'd have to start all over again. The head of government in the German Empire was the Chancellor, okay, the Reichschancellor. This is essentially the Prime Minister. They just call them chancellors. He was appointed by the monarch, and he could only be hired and fired by the monarch, meaning as long as he had the support of the king, Kaiser, then that was all he needed. He couldn't be fired by Parliament. Parliament was a bicameral two-house legislature. There were two houses, of course. The first house, the upper house, was called the Bundesrat. This is where the nobility had their say. Members of the nobility were appointed by the Kaiser for a fixed term. And after that term was over, he could either reappoint or appoint new nobility to that position. The lower house was called the Reichstag, and it was elected by the middle class. Now, you see, we talked about conservative monarchy, or conservative democracy. This is where we get this conservative democracy. The middle class and the upper class were able to vote. The lower classes were not. Interestingly enough, though, women were allowed to vote in the German Empire long before they were allowed to vote in the United States of America. By the way, we talk about during World War II, we talk about even today, Parliament in Germany is so well known because of the building that the Reichstag, the lower house, met in, that today this bicameral legislature or parliament is called the Reichstag. Even today, the upper house is called the Bundesrat and the lower house is called the Bundestag. They changed Reichstag to Bundes. Bundes means country versus realm or empire. But they still call the building. You go over there today and you can visit it. Like we call ours Congress, they call the building the Reichstag. In Germany, they also did the multi-party coalition governments. The only thing that was different about this was because of the nature of the prime minister position, the chancellor, it was a little more stable than what would go on in France. Sure, they would have parties rise and fall, but the prime minister, the chancellor, was able to stay in power. Also, the Kaiser could rule by decree during times of emergency. This is very similar to this idea that we have in the United States of presidential executive orders. This is actually kind of where that idea came from, and we've always had that particular clause, one way or another, the presidents were able to do that. We got that from the conservative constitutional monarchies, especially Great Britain, when it was a conservative constitutional monarchy. So yes, it's multi-party, but it's much more stable than what existed in France. Now, Germany was the largest continental power. Okay, even though Great Britain was probably the premier power in the world at this point, Germany is the largest continental power. It also has the world's largest, most technologically advanced army. The Prussian army, and then later the German army, was the best led, the best equipped, the largest in Europe, and they were in many ways a killing machine. Many American soldiers were actually sent to Prussia to study under the Prussian military generals. And what a lot of people don't realize is actually the U.S. Army was founded by a Prussian. Now, not founded as in, we know that the Constitutional Convention, or not the Constitutional Convention, I'm sorry, it's late, see what happens when it's late. The Continental Congress created the American Army, but the father of that army is a guy by the name of Baron von Steuben, the guy who actually trained Washington's soldiers at Valley Forge. He was a Prussian military general that they brought over to help train the American troops. So the Prussians and later the Germans are well known for being very, very good at war. Another conservative constitutional monarchy is the Kingdom of Italy. And their head of state was a hereditary monarch, a king, who, like the German Kaiser, could appoint or dismiss the prime minister and had absolute veto power over legislation. The head of government was the prime minister. He was appointed by the monarch. They had a bicameral legislature. They called theirs parliament. Their upper house was called the Senate. It was appointed by the king. Now, it wasn't just members of the nobility. It was also the wealthy, or what they called people of significant gifts. So your VIPs in society. Not necessarily your Kardashians, though. The lower house was the Chamber of Deputies, and this was elected from the middle class. So again, the lower classes did not have a vote in the Kingdom of Italy. They did have multi-party coalition governments, but again, like the German model, because of the prime minister being appointed by the monarch and only being responsible to him, it was a much more stable democracy than the French Republic. Now that we talked about the democracies, let's talk about the pseudo-democracies or the autocracies. And the first one is the Russian Empire. This is an absolute monarchy. This is an autocracy. One man, one rule. The head of state and the head of government is combined into one position, the hereditary monarch. Now, they called their ruler the Tsar. You can spell that either T-S-A-R or C-Z-A-R. It's the same thing. And this essentially means Caesar as well. It's Russian for Caesar. This is their emperor, the Emperor of Russia. He had unlimited power. The only limits on his power is that he had to be a member of the Orthodox Church. Okay? He is the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, so he had to be a member of it. The only other limit on his power is he had to obey the succession laws, meaning he had to allow whoever was going to take over after him to be the heir to the throne. Okay, he couldn't change it up. They did have a legislature. It was called the Duma, but he appointed all the members of the Duma, and it was essentially a rubber stamp. It was an advisory council for him. All the final legislative power belonged to the Tsar. So a lot of times what the Tsar would do is he'd say, I want this legislation passed. Here's my notes. This is what I want. They would go and write the legislation for him, and then once the legislation was written, he'd look at it, he'd make corrections, and then he'd sign it, and that would become law. The Russian Empire was the largest empire by landmass. It didn't have any overseas colonies, but it was 11 time zones wide. It went all the way from the German border all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But what was sad about the Russian Empire is, in all aspects of life, it was well behind Europe. we always think of Russia as being European, and it is. Historically, it's considered to be European history. But because of the large amount of Asian population within it, also the fact that they tended to turn away from Europe many times in their history, it was nowhere near as technologically advanced or even sociologically advanced. Just to give you an example, France abolished the idea of serfdom in the 1780s, 1790s. The Russian Empire did not abandon the idea of serfs until 1860s. Okay, we're talking right around the time of the American Civil War. I believe it was 1862 to be exact. So it was definitely a lot longer. They were pretty much the last of all the European countries to end serfdom, which was essentially farm slavery in Europe. The next of these countries is the Austro-Hungarian Empire, sometimes referred to as Austria-Hungary. This is a pseudo-constitutional monarchy, and it's very conservative. There was a little bit of democracy, but tiny bit. And it's hard to describe this country because it's not really one country. It's actually two countries combined into one. The Austrian Empire, at a certain point in the 1800s, broke up into the Austrian Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary. And they just so happened to keep the same head of state, a hereditary monarch. In Austria, they were called a Kaiser, the Emperor of Austria. In Hungary, they were the King of Hungary. But it was the same position. In both countries, the emperor had the right to appoint and dismiss the chancellor, and he also had absolute veto power over legislation. He had a head of government in both countries, the chancellor, and it was appointed by him, the monarch. And I say he because in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you really were not allowed to be a female ruler. And to be honest, neither could you in Germany. Russia had some female rulers, Catherine the Great, Empress Elizabeth, but not in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, there was a bicameral legislature in both countries. It was called the Imperial Council. And in Austria, the upper house was called the House of Lords, and it was the aristocracy, and they got their seats by birth. The lower house was called the House of Deputies, and they were elected from the upper class and the middle classes. Same thing in Hungary. The upper class was called the House of Magnates. It was aristocracy that inherited their seats by birth. In the lower house in Hungary, it was the House of Representatives, again, elected from the upper and middle classes. These were multi-party coalition governments in both countries, but underneath the overall realm of the Kaiser. And since 1848, the emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a guy by the name of Franz Joseph. He had been on the throne forever. And this was causing a problem because this dual monarchy, as they called it, this multi-nation state, had a lot of tension, had a lot of cultural and ethnic tension. And really, the only thing that was keeping it together by 1912, 1914 was Franz Joseph in his own person. And he will die in the middle of the war and be replaced by his nephew. And by 1919, the Austro-Hungarian Empire will cease to exist. It will split into an independent Austria and an independent Hungary. So World War I will essentially be the cause of death for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Finally, you have a country that doesn't exist today either. It's very hard to describe this country because it's kind of a fluid country, but it's called the Ottoman Empire. And this was a pseudo-constitutional monarchy and theocracy. And what does that mean exactly? Well, the head of state was also the head of religion. It was a hereditary monarch called the Sultan. He was also a religious figure known as the Caliph. Okay, the Ottoman Empire also had the Ottoman Caliphate. And so he was the, let's just say, he was the Pope of the Islamic world, so to speak. He appointed and dismissed his prime minister, who they called the Grand Vizier. But in many cases, he was removed from politics. He didn't get involved in the political aspect of it, but he had absolute veto power because of his religious position. So he didn't get his hands dirty when it came to legislation, but he sure would overrule things if he decided he didn't like them. The head of his government was called the Grand Vizier. He was the de facto ruler of the empire. And he did the day-to-day operations of the Ottoman Empire. Now, when we think of Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Empire was huge at one time. It's not that big today. By today, I mean 1914 time period. It had gotten a lot smaller, but it still controlled what is now Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Iraq, parts of what is now Saudi Arabia. So it was a large land empire. They did have some political parties here, but they were very weak political parties. They had very little, if any, influence. You had the Committee of Union and Progress, which was a more secular body. You had the Liberal Union Party, and you had the Ottoman Socialist Party. This was probably the most backwards and antiquated of all the countries that were considered modern, especially in Europe. It's one of two theocracies. The Vatican City is the other one in Europe. And it just isn't prepared for a war. The best way I can describe this is the Ottoman Empire is living a 1600s existence in a 1900s world. Okay? They're just not capable of surviving a modern war. And that's exactly what will happen to the Ottoman Empire. They will end up going extinct after this. They will come out of this pseudo-alive. By 1918, they will they'll lose the war, but they'll still sort of exist. But within a few years, the Turkish forces within the empire will end up overthrowing the Sultan and creating a secular democratic state. Mustafa Kemal, they now refer to him as Ataturk. I don't know if anybody's been paying attention to the news, but he is the guy that they named the airport for that just got attacked. The bombings that happened a few days ago, the airport there in Turkey is named for him.